Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Muslim Professional Forum, I would like to welcome all of you for tonight's discussion, the challenging racism in multicultural society. First of all, we apologize for starting a little bit of delay due to our technical reason. And then hope that you would forgive us for this delay, and then we start just now. My name is Khaled Noor. By profession, I'm a lawyer. I'm a member of as a bar of Lincoln, and also I'm a solicitor and practicing as solicitor and principal of Blackstone Solicitors. And also I'm the chair of Muslim Professional Forum and also a local councillor in London Borough of Redbridge. Tonight we have a distinguished panel of guest speakers with me today. Our first speaker is Professor Tariq Modood, and also we are very fortunate that we have joined with us today Jeremy Corbyn MP, the former leader of the Labour Party. I'm very fortunate and also privileged to welcome both of the distinguished panel of guests, and then we hope that a good discussion. Before I do so any further introduction, let me introduce about Professor Tariq Modood. He is the founding director of the Center for Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at University of Bristol. Professor Modood also one of our patrons. And Professor Modood tonight will be presenting his brief discussion on what is multicultural society mean, what does it mean, and its relevance to fight against racism. And then after Professor Modood's presentation, we will hear from Jeremy Corbyn, a brief introduction, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Those are hearing live on Facebook, please, you can share your question on the Facebook Live. We'll try to pick up a few questions if appropriate. So without further ado, Professor Tariq Modood, over to you now. He will present a brief introduction of multicultural society. What does it mean and relevance to fight against racism? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khalid, and Assalamu alaikum and hello, everybody. And I'm delighted and indeed it's an honor to be able to present tonight with Jeremy Corbyn joining us. So I have a PowerPoint, if that could be put on the screen, I'll talk to the PowerPoint. Here we are. So that's my center. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's the title I've given my 15-minute talk. If we go to the next slide. Right, so here we start then. So here I'd like to say something about what I understand anti-racism to be. And I think it has three dimensions or logical phases. And those are the ones I present on this slide. So the first one is anti-racism as anti-racial discrimination, consisting of laws, policies, and procedures. And I'm not going to say anything really more about that because I think we all understand what that is. The next dimension of anti-racism is anti-racism as what I've got here, slightly academic expression, as de-othering, which means challenging the stereotypes, the ways that a group of people other another group, which is another way of saying racializes another group through stereotypes and negative images about that group. And this anti-racism then consists of combating and overturning the negative discourses that other groups of the population, and of course overturning and disrupting the social processes of racialization that further those kinds of stereotypes and exclusions. I'm mainly going to be talking about the third dimension, which is anti-racism as positive identity affirmation. Probably the best example we have of that, of turning a negative into a positive, is really the lead that African Americans, and then later followed by Black people in Britain and elsewhere, the lead that African Americans took in challenging white perceptions and white ideas about what Black people were. And in the 1950s, 60s, black was thought to be a very negative term in America and in Britain. But African Americans said, no, it's not negative. We are proud to be black. Black is beautiful. You think there's something degrading about black. We are happy to be black. In fact, we are black and proud. And that's what I mean by positive identity affirmation, turning a negative into a positive. If we go to the next slide, please. So here, I want to say that there are two dimensions of minority identities. When we talk about, positive and negative identities, there are these two dimensions. So the negative one is the one that's imposed from the outside, imposed by a dominant group, imposed by white people on other groups of the population. And in sociology, we call that an ascriptive identity because it's stuck on people by others, and it's therefore a form of othering. And these are racialized identity, exactly the identities that anti-racism challenges. And of course, it's based on the idea that anyone who is othered like that has a right to resist those racialization, that othering. But beyond that, there is a right to struggle for a positive identity. And I would say that the difference between anti-racism and multiculturalism is really the question, which should have priority? Resisting a negative identity or struggling for a positive identity? This is really the difference between anti-racism and multiculturalism, as I'll now explain if we go to the next slide. So positive identity affirmation, in fact, is the bridge from anti-racism to multiculturalism. For multiculturalists, de-othering negative identities is essential, but the ultimate goal must be public acceptance of self-defined and self-valued collective identities. And of course, I've just been talking about an example of that, the number one on the slide, namely turning a negative racial identity into a positive racial identity, as the African Americans did with black, and then black people in Britain and elsewhere too. But that's not the only way to have positive identity affirmation in an anti-racist way. And on the slide, below the dotted lines, I offer two other ways. There is refusing a racialized identity for an ethnic identity. For example, rejecting that someone thinks you're black or brown or whatever stereotype they have of you, and asserting that you are an Indian or a Somalian, and organizing collectively with Indians and Somalians as an ethnic group, as an ethnic mobilization. That's also a refusal of a racial identity, but different from the case I was talking about earlier, the African American case. And then at the bottom of this slide, I talk about refusing a racialized identity for a religious identity like Sikh or Muslim. And this is really based on the recognition that there are multiple racisms, of which, say Islamophobia is a very good example, a very prominent example of cultural racism today, where people are racialized on the basis of their religion or their perceived religion. And not only are there multiple racisms, but people have multiple minority identities. That's to say, there are lots of different minorities. And these different multiple minorities are not simply within one register. That's to say, there are different kinds of groups and different kinds of identities, including compound or mixed identities, which are both ethnic and religious, ethno-religious identities. I think most British Muslims and Muslims in Western Europe actually have a kind of mixed ethno-religious identity. And it's this particular form of anti-racism that's really the path to multiculturalism. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So on this slide, we're now into what I think of as multiculturalism proper, because the central idea of multiculturalism, coming from Charles Taylor, is the idea of recognition and misrecognition, how dominant groups don't properly recognize groups that they hold in contempt or hold as inferior. And instead, multiculturalism, of course, challenges that with the idea of equality as respect, which isn't just about treating all individuals the same, but respecting people's group identities. And of course, especially those groups who've been misrecognized, which of course has been one of the experience of British Muslims. They've been misrecognized as a racial group, as black, or they've been misrecognized as an ethnic group, say Pakistanis. And many Muslims have therefore asserted a Muslim identity, demanding that identity be recognized by other British people, by the British population. And that means the importance in multiculturalism of self-definitions. Groups should be able to define themselves, and they should be able to define what oppression, what racism they are suffering from. This should come from the group itself. They should be able to identify their victimhood. And we have therefore a multiplicity and fluidity and actually mixing of identities. That's what I mean by hybrid identities there. And all identities have this element of fluidity, which means that groups should be able to not just define themselves, but redefine themselves, draw new boundaries, coalesce with other groups, be a mixture of identities and so on, rather than a flattening or relativizing of identities. As I'm running a little bit behind time, I won't go too much into that, but very happy to discuss the idea of flattening or relativizing identities. But I'll just conclude this slide by saying that means that an example of this is where at the time of the Satanic Verses crisis, or what's called the Rushdie affair, many very well-meaning anti-racists, mainly white and black anti-racists, said to Muslims, and they, people had badges and leaflets distributing these things. They said, attack racism, not Rushdie. They couldn't see the ways in which Muslims felt they were being oppressed. They were inviting them to share a different experience of oppression, or to put it more accurately, they were inviting them to redefine their oppression in a different way, in a way that suited other groups, but not necessarily Muslims. I turn then to the last slide, because my final point is really about equal citizenship, which I think is absolutely fundamental, both to anti-racism and to multiculturalism. Both equality as sameness or non-discrimination and equality as respect are based on the idea of national citizenship, and to which minorities want to belong and should have a right to belong. Typically, minorities want to belong to something bigger than just a group. For example, a national citizenship. And this means the negotiation, the rethinking or hyphenating of national identities, not just an assimilation into an existing national identity, but a reworked national identity, a renegotiated, adapted national identity. And I think this is exactly what's happening at the moment, and it's been reactivated by the current agitation from the Black Lives Matter movement, the rethinking about the importance of slavery in the making of Britain and British history and the British Empire, in explaining the kind of society we have today, how in fact we've all been brought together, and making that a part of our understanding of what it is to be British and what needs to be done so that all can feel British. And so public minority identities and categories must be consistent with this self-identity, this group identity that groups want to assert to overturn misrecognition or imposed racial identities. And that means that people's understanding of themselves as Black British or British Indian should be central to anti-racism, as it is indeed to multiculturalism. In the last 2 decades, British identification has become very common with ethnic minorities. Indeed, in some ways, more so than with whites. And I think that ethnic minority monitoring categories must never suggest that some people are British while others are Black or Pakistani or Chinese. Rather, the public categories that we use, whether it's in monitoring or in public discourses, they must affirm the Britishness of minorities, not other than. Thank you. That's really my explanation of the link between anti-racism and multiculturalism.
Professor, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and thought-provoking as always. Obviously, we went a little bit beyond our time because of technical difficulty. I started a little bit late, but hopefully we can compensate these things at the time of question and answer sessions. Our next speaker is Jeremy Corbyn MP. Jeremy Corbyn MP is a lifelong campaigner against racism and in favor of multicultural society. After stepping down as leader of the Labour Party, he launched a project for peace and justice to create a platform for network and resource that can support campaigners for social justice and progressive change. Jeremy Corbyn, I'm very pleased and proud and privileged to welcome you once again after quite a long time, as you always been a supporter of Muslim Professional Forum since 2011. And I just welcome you, and I hope that you can make a brief presentation before we go to question and answer session on about way to challenge racism in the UK. Thank you.
Khalid, thank you so much for inviting me today. And on behalf of many, can I say a big thank you to you, Khalid, for the work you do, not just for the Muslim Professional Forum, but for so many other groups and people within our society and those that you represent in your own community, because you do a fantastic job. And I value that, I recognize that, and more importantly, so do thousands of other people. And it's a pleasure also to be on with Professor Tariq, and very interested in what he just said in his presentation. I'm sorry I can't match the slide presentation that he's made. It'll just be my voice, I'm sorry to say. But I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion that we are going to have. Racism is an ever-present debate in our society. And I just rushed back here from Nottingham, where we were doing some events for the Project for Justice and Peace. We did an event last night in Broxtowe. But before that, I spent a lot of time at a big food distribution centre run by the Asian community in Nottingham mainly, but there are many other people involved in it. And we had a long discussion about their contribution to society, and also the prevalence of racism within the city, and the perceptions and the reality of racism in employment practices, and to me, very surprisingly, the paucity, very, very small number of black teachers in schools in Nottingham, which of course is a very multicultural city. And so we're going to Nottingham again in November, and we're doing a discussion meeting as part of the news clubs that we're setting up all around the country to challenge the conventional media narrative, the mainstream media narrative, and of course the unfair ownership of media in this country. But we're also having another part to our event that day, which is going to be a discussion of history and history teaching and the way in which our children develop perceptions, conceptions, and perceptions because of the way in which their teaching of history is done in schools. And I'll come back to that when I conclude my remarks. And so in our society, we've got to recognize where we are and where we've come from. Britain has never been free of racism. The racial superiority that enabled the slave trade in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, that said to all white British people, you are innately superior to the rest of the world, therefore it's okay to have a slave trade, it's okay to go out and occupy and oppress and destroy people's lives and hopes. And whilst there have obviously been enormous changes, there's always been struggles against racism in Britain. The racism that faced those relatively small number of people that came from Africa or the Caribbean or South Asia to Britain in the 18th and 19th century, the racism that the Jewish migrants from Russia faced in the 1890s and early 1900s, those that fled from the pogroms in Russia, and then the, frankly, hypocrisy in the way in which the First World War was fought and presented. Tens of thousands of soldiers from India, then British India, Africa and the Caribbean died on the Western Front and other places, barely recognized, unrecognizable in the memorials at the end of World War I. And so they were sort of written out of the historical narrative. Fast forward to the Second World War, the heroism of soldiers from all over the world that fought to try and defeat fascism in Europe, they came from all over the world. But the racism that they suffered in the British Army, the racism that Black American soldiers suffered in the US Army, and indeed the lynchings and the discrimination that went on against Black American soldiers in Britain during the Second World War, again, something largely written out of history. Anyone who doubts that, read Andrea Levy's wonderful book, The Small Island, which describes the way in which Black American soldiers survived, or indeed the way in which Indian soldiers were treated and survived during the war. So those issues do have to be addressed, and it comes down to history. Then we had the post-war struggles of the Windrush generation that came in the 1940s. And I say the Windrush generation, they use that term generally to include all those that migrated to Britain from then colonies, now former colonies of Britain, and the struggle for racial justice in Britain and the brutality of it, the way in which the Sikh people fought for their recognition, their right to wear their own attire and their own clothing, the way in which Caribbean people fought against the racism that was meted out against them. And then the bravery of those that stood up on the Bristol bus boycott, or those that stood up in Birmingham, and those that stood up against racism in Birmingham, West Midlands area in the 1960s and 70s. And so it is an ongoing struggle. And whilst there might be differences now, you start to look at perceptions, you look at outcomes, you look at the way the police treat people, you look at the prison population, you look at achievement levels in school and underachievement levels in school, and you begin to see the levels of institutional racism that still exists in many parts of British society. The Macpherson report was a revelation to some when it came out. To others, it was a confirmation of what they'd already suspected, being in operation for a very long time. So it is about challenging that racism. Islamophobia is present in our society. It's present in attitudes towards Islam. It's present in attitudes towards young people, and it's present in attitudes towards particularly Muslim women and the way in which they suffer unbelievable levels of abuse on buses and trains, and often say nothing about it and stoically take it on board. And this, in some parts of Europe, is dealt with by banning clothing, by banning head coverings, by banning face coverings. Unfortunately, we've never gone down that road in this country, and I would be totally opposed to that. People should dress the way they wish to dress with the symbolism they wish to. That surely has to be the right way forward of accepting what is a wider multicultural society. So it is those things that are so important. The debate on anti-Semitism is important also because the historic vile discrimination against Jewish people, which goes back hundreds of years from their expulsion in the 13th century to Britain to their readmission to Britain in the 17th century, but the discrimination and anti-Semitism that went on. And so it is about opposing all forms of racism, be it Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, or cultural racism against Islam, against Judaism, against Catholicism, or against Hindu, for example, or Buddhism. And so it is about understanding that multicultural society. So I move on to the last part of what I want to say, because I'd be interested in what friends on this call have to say about it. I have a passion for understanding history. And what I said at the beginning of my talk was that I'm concerned the way our children are being brought up with a rather strange history of the world. In primary school, our children are taught about sort of Romans, Normans, Tudors, and the Second World War, and sometimes not a lot else. And then in secondary school, it gets a bit better, but you only start getting to any understanding of the broad concepts of history and the notions of racial superiority that accompanied European expansion when you get to A-level or university teaching. And I think we have to do a lot to change this. Black History Month, great idea, but it's got to go much further than that. I don't want Black History Months. I don't want special months for special parts of history. I want that whole understanding of what colonialism and imperialism was about and is about to be part of the normal curriculum that all of our children experience in school. Because children in a nursery are not racist. They don't recognize difference between each other. If you've had the joy, as many of us had, of taking children or grandchildren to their sort of first day at nursery and watching them explore identity, develop, interact, social interaction, and so on, it's only later on that they start getting notions about superiority, notions of what is good or what is bad. Now, where does that come from? It comes, yes, from images on our media. It comes from a teaching and understanding of history and the ideas of superiority of one group over another or one nation over another. So I think it's time that we had a serious debate about the way in which history is taught. And the Black Lives Matters movement has had a resonance all around the world of people who feel that their identity has not been recognized, their experience has not been recognized, their discrimination has not been recognized. So it is, I think, high time we had that debate and that discussion, because to confront racism and create a truly equal society where faiths are I don't like to use the word tolerated because I don't want to tolerate somebody. I want to respect somebody. And I'd rather use the word respect than tolerance in relation to faiths, to different communities, and so on, because that is what brings about a more effective, a more successful and cohesive society. Refugees made their home in this country for many years. But actually, in global terms, the number of refugees in Britain is actually quite small. Far greater numbers are found in Jordan, found in Bangladesh, found in other countries around the world than in Britain or anywhere in Western Europe. And so that debate about Afghanistan refugees coming here ought to be accompanied by a debate about the rights of all refugees around the world, and recognizing that those 70 million people also have a right to live on this planet, also have a right to make their contribution to this planet. So racism is understanding where it all comes from and who's empowered and who's weakened by racism, and standing up against it. And as one who represents an inner city community, I'm proud to call the mosque my neighbors, where I go quite often. I do advice bureaus and stuff like that at them, because that really is what the stuff of the community is about, in all its glory, in all its diversity. But that's what makes us strong, and making sure all our young people have an equal chance in society. We're not going to achieve that if we allow racism to weaken and divide us. And that surely is what today brings us together on this call. Khalid, thank you so much for inviting me today.
Jeremy, thank you very much for your eloquent presentation, and it's matchless. The amount of time you spend for your whole life, last 40 years, on addressing the racial equality and also the multicultural society, respecting migrants and also welcoming refugees. This is tremendous achievement and tremendous work we're doing. And also your presentation, last 10 minutes, I hope that I can continue, allow you to speak another 10-15 minutes so we can benefit.
No. You shouldn't allow me to go on too long. You should never allow politicians unlimited speaking time. It never works.
Right. Okay, that's fine. Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation. I have some question written, and I don't think that I will be able to do justice with all this issue arises, and also some other issue I want to discuss. First of all, I will ask the question to Professor in terms of your contribution on multiculturalism. And you have been rightly described that you are one of the multiculturalists and also one of the authority. And then you link that multiculturalism is obviously linking with the different kinds of characteristic and also identity, including religious identity, and also part of this identity in also political identity that is addressing and also is very important for our discourse and addressing the racism. But before I go into this in detail about the religion and also multiculturalism, both from your presentation, also Jeremy's presentation, come about the Black Lives Matters movement. And Black Lives Matters movement has mainly generated a understanding and movement of tackling racism and becoming widespread acceptance all over the world, including the UK. But on the other hand, the multiculturalism getting strong criticism from the media and from the establishment on the right, left, from sometimes different kinds of authors as well. Why do you think that the different kinds of treatment? Because the both are working to establish a just and tolerant society.
Yes, that's a very good question, Khalid. I think one of the reasons why white people, for instance, find it easier to accept an anti-racism based on, objecting to and fighting against color racism, as opposed to other kinds of racism, is that there are two classic long-term racisms in our region of the world. In what we might call the Atlantic area, there's basically white racism against black people, meaning people of African descent. So we see that from the European Atlantic coast, down to West Africa, the West Indies, of course, North America, and indeed South America as well. So this is often, this is the exact historical path of slavery. In continental Europe, in contrast, the dominant racism, so that when Germans, for instance, say Rassismus, they're thinking about anti-Semitism. For them, the primary target of racism isn't people of African descent, but Jewish people. So groups like Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs, they don't fit into the most long-standing ideas or paradigms of racism and anti-racism. And so people like me, for instance, for the last decades, number of decades, have been talking about making sure that we don't understand racism only in terms of color, but also in terms of cultural racism, where people are inferiorized, excluded, vilified, and so on, not just on the basis of their, as it were, ancestral descent or physical appearance, but because they're supposed to represent a despised cultural identity, a despised religion, and so on. And I think that in Western Europe particularly, that kind of cultural racism actually is the dominant form of racism. It's certainly not the only important form of racism. Obviously, we have various kinds of color racisms as well. And Black Lives Matter is targeted at one kind of color racism. But if we think of multiple racisms, then we have to have a multiculturalist perspective on racism, which, as I tried to argue, builds on the anti-racist idea of rejecting inferiorized identities in favor of positive self-group identities, as the African Americans did with the idea of Black identity. So I would say that is one of the reasons that a lot of people who say they're in favor of anti-racism and Black Lives Matter are doubtful about multiculturalism and anti-Islamophobia and so on.
Professor, thank you. I just come to Jeremy Corbyn now on this very important issues. I think I remember, if I rightly saw, if I incorrect, please forgive me and also correct me. I think so. When David Cameron was Prime Minister in 2011, in question of multiculturalism, and he just, in response, he said that state doctrine of multiculturalism has failed. And also, he just proposed about the muscular liberalism, that is equality for all. Jeremy, do you think that multiculturalism has failed?
No, I absolutely do not. And I think multiculturalism is very important. I remember David Cameron saying exactly that. And sadly and rather surprisingly, Angela Merkel said something on broadly the same lines around that time. Now, I don't quite know what motivated David Cameron to say that, but and I'm not quite sure what he meant, unless he was suggesting we sort of go down the French ultra-secular route of saying you don't recognize any difference or diversity, you embrace the values of France to the exclusion of all else, which is a slight parody of it, but not far off. And I can only think that's what Cameron was doing. I don't see the world that way. I think the right and need for expression of people through their identity, through their faith, is something that is very, very important. Think back to 1950s, 1960s Britain. At least I'm old enough to be able to think back. Others in this call, maybe not. That time, Black children growing up in Britain were not taught anything about their history any more than Indian children were. They were taught about colonialism and expansion, an empire on which the sun never set, etc. And they grew up being taught by white teachers about the wonders and powers of British imperialism. And at that time, a group living just around the corner from this office, actually, wrote a book called Education and the West Indian Child. And it was directed at Haringey Council, but it was directed at the ILEA, Inland Education Authority, and other councils as well, about the way in which teachers were recruited, the way in which young black kids were taught, and the way in which many of them were then deemed to be underachieving, the way in which many of those ended up either excluded or in what we now refer to as pupil referral units. And as a result, many of those underachieved. Fast forward 15, 20 years, we had all kinds of papers written about the underachievement of Bangladeshi youngsters in school. And so it went on, and lots of theories were put forward. I think it is about recognizing the diversity and the identity of people and then being proud of it. So I think we should celebrate all big festivals, Diwali, Eid, Rosh Hashanah. Celebrate all of them so that our children grow up understanding that diversity isn't a weakness, it's actually a strength and a power in society. And if you're giving equal prominence to all of those kind of events, then actually that's a very strong message to all children in school and all young people in our society. So this concept of multiculturalism is dead. No, I can't accept that at all. I don't think it's dead at all. I think actually I live in a very multicultural community. I'm very happy in that community. I enjoy it. I enjoy the diversity of it. And I'm not pretending it's all simple and not easy. There isn't racism. There is racism. Not pretending it's not very difficult for some people. It is very difficult. But the opposite of suppressing identity, suppressing diversity, is far worse.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Thank you for your answer. In terms of one of the criticism, Professor Modood, about the multiculturalism, that in terms of the British and Britishness, and there is argument is that multiculturalism create a parallel society, and that is something was found in the Beku-Parek's report in 2001, I think so. There was a future of multi-ethnic Britain, and it was proposed something like this: the community of communities and individual or citizens. And you also presented these things. What's the problem with this then? Because it is clear that, as we presented, Jeremy said that we celebrate each other's diversity and differences, but at the same time, we live side by side as a community. So why not we can take this seriously, a serious debate at the community of communities and citizens or individuals?
Yes, thank you in particular for reminding us of the Tariq report, or the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain report, because that's one of the things I've been most proudest to have participated in, but unfortunately for various reasons, it's not often mentioned these days. So I think, first of all, people like me have to acknowledge that there can be segregation in a negative way. So by that, what I mean is, you say people living side by side. Well, yes, of course. So, the community of communities idea that you referred to. But sometimes people have so little interaction with, interest in, and understanding of other people. Exactly the opposite of what Jeremy was talking about when he was talking about multiculturalist Islington. Multiculturalist Islington is a mix of peoples. Yes, people are living side by side, there are communities and so on, but they're not separate communities. So that's segregation wouldn't be the right way of describing a place like Islington. But there are parts of England, especially in the northern cities, where there were, riots and disturbances, and then we had the Cantle report that then brought out this phrase about parallel societies and so on. I think it is true that there are people, or at least it was true then, it's less true today, but 20 years ago, there were people who had very little to do with each other. So they were a community. You had a let's say a Pakistani Muslim community, working class community, and you had a white English working class community living side by side, but they weren't a community living together. So they weren't a community of communities. They were two separate communities. So that is not the multiculturalist ideal. That is the caricature that is thrown at multiculturalists like Jeremy and I when they say, oh, so you're in favor of segregation and separatism and so on. We're not. We acknowledge that this can sometimes happen. And when it's the case, we need to address it. We need to bring people together, of course. I think there's a very good book that's just been recently published, and I'm just reading it at the moment, and I heard it on Radio 4 last week, by the former Guardian journalist Sarfraz Mansour, and he's of Pakistani heritage, called They. I recommend it to everyone listening now. And unlike academics like me, it's very accessible, very easily written, where he weaves his own personal story of being brought up as a British Pakistani with stories of other British Pakistanis and some other light research and so on. And what he shows is that communities that don't live together have very negative and stereotypical pictures of the other people who they call they. They say they do this, they are wrong, they're bad, they're inferior, we are good, we're superior, and so on. So this can happen amongst minorities. It's not only dominant groups that can other people, can exclude people. So I would say that the ideal has to be of a broader society that is not hostile to communities. Jeremy mentioned the French case, where they proudly say that their Republican ideals require them to be hostile to any kind of communities, a Jewish community or Muslim community or Black community or whatever. That's obviously the opposite of multiculturalism. But it doesn't mean that multiculturalism is about separate communities. So we then have to think together, what brings us together? And obviously anti-racism separates us. Racism separates us. So anti-racism is a very important plank in bringing people together, in creating a community of communities, but also the kind of thing that Jeremy said about respecting other people's religious identities. That also was central to the Tariq report and to the multiculturalist idea. And so what we have to do then, and this is exactly what we tried to do with the Tariq report, is to argue that we have to have a multiculturalist understanding of British society and what it is to be British. This is the opposite of assimilation. This is the opposite of top-down Britishness, British values imposed by the government on minorities and people who don't want it. This is a spontaneous growth, though it does require political leadership. You don't sit back and just wait for it to happen. A movement, a nurtured movement, where we come to think that there is multiple ways of being British and all should be respected, and we broaden and complexify our idea of what it is to be British so that it is inclusive as opposed to exclusive. So that's the community of communities idea.
Professor, thank you very much for your long but eloquent answer. I think there's lots of things in there. I just go into this relevant question to Jeremy now about the tolerance and respect. Jeremy said that he doesn't want to say the word tolerance, but he wants to emphasize about respect. In respecting in terms of the multiculturalism, as I understand, and reading this book from Professor Tariq Modood, there's a very good book. The multiculturalism is not only just about to racial equality, it's much more than that. It is about religions, religious symbol, religious dress, the language, and also the cultural equality as well. So when this comes to the respect for, we can see that in the words sometimes that when discussion come about the religious rule, especially in particular to Muslim communities and Muslim women, you mentioned, that there always debate come about the liberal society, what kinds of dress a Muslim women can choose, and if there's something is their own volition, own intention, own choosing. Then we can see also refer about the France, the government ban of children to wear certain clothes, and also other European countries. And once we see this, the recent event in Afghanistan, the debate all about, see the more discussion about the what women in Afghanistan can wear and should wear. But when the same something happened in our street in London, or as you mentioned about the in bus or in the train station on the street, because of the wearing a certain cloth or covering their face, even our prime minister, he mentioned about the bank robber and also the letterbox. So do you think that West we have a double standard when you come to about the Muslim identity, Muslim dress, especially Muslim women?
I think there are a lot of double standards at work here. And when Cameron said that the multicultural model had failed, he didn't really explain what he meant by failure. He left us the opportunity of trying to guess what he meant by this. I'm not even sure he'd thought about it very much indeed, unless he was thinking, as I said earlier, and the professor just said, about the French model. So multiculturalism is about understanding the diversity and the strength of diversity of our society. But I'm glad that Professor Tariq took us a bit further on that, because diversity in society and people living together doesn't automatically mean you have a multicultural society. People can live here and here, neighbors, never speak to each other, don't recognize each other's cultures, diversity, needs, or anything else. Physically, yes, they're living within half a meter of each other through a wall of the neighbor's house, but they're not necessarily part of that same community and society. And in some towns in the northwest of Britain, there was actually more interaction between communities during the time when there were large mills and large centers of employment and large employers, because they employed a diversity of people for different skill needs levels and all that. The breakup of the big industries and the big employment centers into lots and lots of a plethora of small businesses and so on, which is an economic phenomenon which has happened all over the country, doesn't necessarily mean there is even that workplace interaction between different groups and different communities. And so it's something that, as an act of policy, you've got to think about quite seriously. Think about it in terms of housing, of education, of access to education and employment access as well as the anti-discrimination policies that have to be adopted at the workplace. Because if we don't think these things through, then we will delude ourselves that we live in a multicultural society, whereas in reality, the lived experience of many people is that they're of different cultures, different faiths, different stories, different backgrounds, but not necessarily understanding or interacting with each other. And then when something bad goes wrong, you suddenly find it all kicks off big time, because what we thought was a society based on respect and cooperation with each other wasn't really that at all. And so this is why I keep coming back to the role of our schools and education within our society. It's understanding the background, understanding the history, but above all, making sure our children do grow up genuinely understanding each other. I love it when I see young people of all kinds of different faiths and backgrounds enjoying things and being out together doing stuff. But quite often, you don't see that. You see groups of young people from the same community out together and not necessarily interacting with each other. You have to watch quite carefully what's happening within our society and the messages in the media, the messages particularly of the French government of Macron towards the Muslim community in France, in which he opened up specifically on the Muslim community, is something that we have to be very well aware of and challenge very, very strongly indeed.
Jeremy, thank you. I'm aware of time about that, and also we have, I can say that we have maximum 15-minute time to conclude our session, and by this time I will try to sum up three questions, so before we sum up. On this note, what Jeremy was saying, and also Professor, you given the clear picture about the broad base of historical aspect of multiculturalism, and that is different, that is between in Western Hemisphere, that is also America and Canada. And in one of your book, you clearly stated that how multiculturalism was successful in Canadian model, but that is something very different in European model, because it is relevant to it some sort of migration that is come from not non-white background, and that also giving some sort of difficulties in here. And one of your book, you mentioned about the Canadian Multiculturalism Act 1988. And you said that, I read this one, where that this act declares that the Canadian government will recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism reflects the culture and racial diversity of Canadian society, and acknowledges that freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. Do you propose something that in this day and age debate of multicultural in the UK, there's something we should propose in this country that parliamentarian member of parliament should consider?
Yes, actually, going back to the Tariq report that you mentioned that came out in 20,000, one of the recommendations was that we should consider having a kind of declaration that Britain is a multicultural society. And that's one of the things that Canada did. And we were deliberately, if you like, applauding, but also wanting to copy what Canada had done. So I am an admirer of Canadian multiculturalism, as you said. But, over time, especially I would say this last 20 years or so, I've also come to see some limitations in the Canadian approach. And actually, there are some advantages in our own British approach. So one thing just to pick up on what you said, so Canadian multiculturalism predates what we might call migration to Canada from Asia and Africa. So there were mainly white migrants that they were thinking about at the time, like people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, Italy and the Ukraine and so on, which is fine, but it's worth recognizing that. And of course, they were also very mindful of the linguistic divide in Canada. And Pierre Trudeau, who was the prime minister at the time, and when he was introducing multiculturalism, he meant that to include somehow that linguistic divide in Canada, the French and the English divide. But the people in Quebec actually said, no, we're not part of multiculturalism. We are a nation in our own right. We are a founding nation of Canada. Canada has two founding nations. The other thing that's quite different about Canada compared to Britain is that Canada has always had a highly welcoming but selective immigration. So most migration into Canada has been from people who are coming to be professionals, going to university, or they already have professional qualifications. So it's been very much a professional and commercial migration, whereas we know in the British case, it's very largely been people coming from South Asia, people coming from the Caribbean, very largely a working class migration. So that's a greater challenge where you have a class challenge as well as a cultural diversity challenge. And Canada only had one aspect rather than both of those. And finally, I think Canada assumed that religion would not be part of multiculturalism. And as religious identity and issues around Muslim identity, and we've been talking about that this evening, as that became more prominent in Canada, especially in the province of Quebec, their multiculturalism has not known how to handle it. So they have actually some of their multiculturalism is very good and is a model for Britain and for other places. But when it comes to religion, they're not really teaching us anything because they're not succeeding. And I think that in Britain, we're actually doing better than many other places in the world, including Canada and including some of our European neighbors.
Thank you, Professor. I'm just stopping. Thank you very much for the spelling out, also fleshing a little bit off about the difference between multicultural approach in Canada and in the UK. But I want to carry on this question to Jeremy as well. As the professor mentioned about the Tariq report that proposed or also recommended that we should some sort of a declaration that UK is a multicultural society, and as I refer a Canadian Citizenship, Multiculturalism Act. Do you think that something is possible to put forward in the Parliament for the MPs to consider?
I think it is important that we have some kind of acceptable definition of what a multicultural society is, but I'm quite nervous of the idea of proposing something specific to Parliament, because I can imagine the sort of debate it might set off. It might be a good debate, but it might be the exact opposite. I mean, the Canadian model is an interesting one, and I think what the Professor was saying about the way Canada has dealt with and recognised both refugees that have come in, but also people that have migrated to Canada. But they've also been quite selective on their migration for a very long time. So they've tended to encourage in skilled people that can immediately benefit the Canadian economy, whereas that wasn't the case in Britain until more recently. But there is a big downside to Canada, and that is its treatment of First Nation Canadians and the terrible experience that First Nation Canadians have had. And Trudeau, Justin, the son of Pierre, had to make that apology for the treatment of First Nation Canadians and the vile behavior that was meted out towards them, which also happened, by the way, in the USA, and also happened, by the way, in Australia against Aboriginal people. So I think in any definition of multicultural society, you have to be inclusive of the ethnicity, the language, the faith, and the place of people in society. But I do think there has to be some way of asserting that to a greater extent, because as we talked about a few minutes ago about people living in proximity to each other, not necessarily in touch with each other, you don't have to go very far outside any major city in Britain, and suddenly the multiplicity of ethnic communities in inner city Britain disappears. You can drive from the centre of Birmingham, Nottingham, Leicester, Manchester, Newcastle, London, Bristol, and so on, not very far into rural areas where there is a completely monocultural existence. You can go to some seaside towns where the tourist industry is a wonderful representation of the diversity of our society. You go to others, there is no representation whatsoever of that diversity. So we've got to be cautious about over-congratulating ourselves on the society we are. We've still got a long way to go.
Jeremy, thank you. I have two more questions before I conclude. In terms of you put forward, Jeremy, in terms of the education and our colonial past, that how this is also contributing some of the issue we're facing in multicultural society and also Islamophobia. And specifically, I have to mention about the Second World War, First World War, that the Muslims were a significant part of the British Army and forces during the First and Second World War. And also the hundreds of military awards given to Muslim soldiers, including seven Muslims were awarded the Victorian Cross, including Khatkudadat Khan, BC. Do you think that it is a good idea that we should propose that Muslim history or Muslim contribution, including the other ethnic communities that contributed to our great wars, First War, Second War, should be part of our academic education, because giving some sort of Muslim recognition of their contribution, this also contribute in multicultural discussion and also reduce some tension.
Yes, I do, absolutely. And it's got to be a representation of the massive sacrifices made by so many people. And that contribution has to be recognised. Whatever one thinks about the justice or injustice of the First World War, and that's obviously a massive, huge debate, nevertheless, the contribution made, which brought about the result it did, the sacrifices made by those people have got to be remembered and recognised, and that in turn helps to build the esteem of the diversity of all communities. It's got to be the right way of doing things. Absolutely.
Thank you. Professor, do you have any comment on this before I go to my final question? Do you have any comment?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. I entirely agree. I think this should be part of the school curriculum. And I think actually more widely, it should be part of public education and public consciousness. Yeah. People, Jeremy's already laid it out in his initial presentation. People think that the First World War and the Second World War, if you forget about Japan in the Second World War, was all about white people fighting other white people in Europe. It wasn't. The empire, and in particular, people from India, Muslims, Sikhs and Hindus, were a massive resource in the Western Front and in other campaigns. And a lot of people lost their lives as well. I think that should be part of our history. I think we should publicly commemorate that properly.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Jeremy. My final question is about Islamophobia. As we discuss about that multiculturalism part of is a cultural identity and recognition of every single religious identity, what is very close to someone's heart as a believer of the particular religion. And do you think, the professor, that you also given the evidence of definition of Islamophobia, FFPG of Muslim, that is Islamophobia is defined as a form of racism. So do you think that Islamophobia is a cultural form of racism that is need to be addressed in the multicultural dimension?
Yes, very much so. I think it's central. Addressing Islamophobia should be central to our thinking about multiculturalism in Britain. Absolutely. We shouldn't just think of anti-racism as just to do with color, and all the things that Jeremy was saying about, in other countries, indigenous peoples, of course, very important, but, linguistic groups, faith-based groups, cultural diversity, because the exclusion, the discrimination, and the perception of people being inferior and of not belonging here is not just about color. It is about their cultural identities. Cultural identities are very important to them and which they don't want to give up. So the acceptance, the belonging, has to include their cultural identity, not require them to give it up, and not to force them to adopt cultural identities that they're not comfortable with, i.e. assimilation. So I do think Islamophobia is a prime example of a form of racism that has to be addressed within a multiculturalist approach as opposed to just an approach based on anti-color racism. But of course, we need to tackle both. It's not one or the other. It's not a competition. We need an understanding of anti-racism that is true to our real world situation in Britain and is able to encompass the multiple racisms and not just one particular kind.
Professor, thank you. Jeremy, over to you now in terms of the Islamophobia. And please forgive me to become a bit political now. The Labour Muslim Network recently published a report about the very difficult reading about the current state of Islamophobia within Labour Party and how the Muslim members and the supporters are addressed and their grievance has been considered, and also considering about the procedures of grievance procedures. As a Labour, as a party of anti-racist party, and you are proud of leading this party for 5 years, do you think the Labour Party is failing the Muslim community addressing the Islamophobia?
I think the Labour Party has to do far more to address Islamophobia within the party. The language that's used in describing those who follow Islam, the way that language is used to describe Muslims within the party, and the experience of some Muslims within the party has to be addressed. That requires a definition, an agreed definition of Islamophobia. It requires absolute opposition to Islamophobia, as one would require opposition to any form of racism within the party. And as the professor quite correctly pointed out, you can have Islamophobia and you can have anti-color racism and put them in separate boxes. But in reality, you've got to address both issues. Otherwise, you end up with the divisions which we are speaking about. So yes, Islamophobia has to be dealt with wherever it appears within our society. And that includes challenging the Prime Minister who made the remarks that he did about Muslim women, but it also means challenging what is strangely often described as casual racism, when there are remarks thrown around in public on buses, on trains and so on. It's not casual, it's deliberate, it's racist, and it's offensive, and it's illegal. And it has to be challenged in that way. And so that means there has to be quite sort of high-profile work on this. I'll give an example of what is really Islamophobia and racism. A group of Muslim women from the mosque near here, you've been in that same mosque, Khalid, you know it as well as I do. They asked to have a meeting with me to discuss the way in which they were being treated on the street post the horrible events that have happened in Britain, Manchester, and so on. And they were describing the way in which they were routinely abused on buses, and what could be done about it. And so I arranged a meeting with Transport for London, with the director of London Buses. And so I turned up at this meeting with the women from the Muslim Women's Group, and he said to me, the director of buses, said, "Okay, Mr. Corbyn, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. What have you got to say?" I said, "I'm very concerned about the treatment of Muslim women on your buses. And that's all I'm going to say, because they're going to say the rest." I didn't say anything more than that. I just let them describe their lives. And he had a whole bunch of officials with him. And they sat there in total silence, like they'd never heard any of this stuff before. And I made them sit there and listen to it all. And I said, now at the end of it, I want some action. I want to know what recordings you're making of people on buses that are abusing women, what you're doing to follow them and trace them down on tubes, and so on. And there were some outcomes of that. There was some improvement. There were some arrests that were made where we could pick up identifiable people that were pursuing them. So the more people that you challenge for their racism in any form in our society and take action against them, the stronger we become as a society and a community. And that's got to be the way forward. So I think, if I may say so, Khalid and Professor, thank you very much for this evening's discussion. it's been very interesting, and I've learned a lot from it. So thank you.
Jeremy, thank you. We just come to our discussion now. Before I conclude, I'll give you the 1 minute to round off to the final words. From first of all, Professor Modood, from you, just maximum 1 minute, please.
Well, I know once I start speaking, I go well over any time given to me. So I think I've said enough. Thank you for allowing me an extra minute, but I'll hand it back to you. I very much agree with everything that I've heard Jeremy say throughout this event. And I find that we're very much on the same page. I'm nodding all the time. So this has been a very happy session for me. I don't want to really say anything more than that. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Professor. Jeremy, over to you for 1 minute, last 1 minute.
You should never offer politicians extra time because they'll always abuse it. They always ask for injury time. They always ask for extra time. They always cry foul. I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm just going to say thank you for the work that you do. And like the professor, I found this very interesting, very agreeable, and very useful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Professor Tariq, Modood, and Jeremy. And we are very privileged to welcome both of you. And finally, over those our listeners, those are listening for about 1 and 15 minutes online via Facebook Live. We try our best to address these important issues, but there are lots of issues, difficult to address all of them. And we hope that you find some of the discussion useful. This discussion and this recording will be always available on Facebook, and inshallah, we try our best to make it available on the YouTube as well. So it will be a permanent record for everyone to come and have a look. And also during this discussion, and if anything we say something, especially from my part, anything factually incorrect or anything we say unintentionally, please forgive us, and hope that we see all of you in our next session. And finally, Jeremy, Professor Modood, good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.